Good afternoon. I'm Nick Gowing for BBC World, but here very much in an independent capacity. As your watches will have told you and your schedule will have told you, we're overrunning a little bit at the moment. So my guess is that we'll probably run till about 5:30. But the last 15 minutes of that will be Bertie Ahern, the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, who is President, of course, of the European Council at the moment. He's going to give some remarks, and my guess is that he will speak at about 5:15. So I think that's the slightly amended schedule which we're working towards. It means we'll have to compress a little bit our thoughts, as the time will be more at a premium than we were expecting. This is not the first session about transatlantic relations. The future of transatlantic relations is what we now want to address. And so what I'm going to do over the next couple of minutes is just highlight what has emerged from the other sessions on transatlantic relations, so we don't go over old ground, that my colleagues up here on the platform can at least address concrete ideas, concrete proposals, concrete thoughts, have a bit of brainstorming, and give you some idea of where things could move, the kind of timescale that we're thinking about, and hopefully perhaps think out of the box a little bit. Let me just summarize the three questions we're going to look at for those of you who haven't been studying your timetable. What are the possible scenarios, or what is the possible scenario for the future of transatlantic relations? Secondly, what impact will the changing nature of transatlantic relations have on the rest of the world? And thirdly, what constructive role can business play in improving relations? We've agreed that actually each of my colleagues up here will speak for 2 or 3 minutes right at the beginning, just to give you some bullet points addressing all three, and then we'll try and take each of those questions a little more individually, but nothing's being prescriptive. So let me just give you some thoughts about what has emerged in the last 3 days on transatlantic relations. Firstly, on the first question about the future scenarios for the future of transatlantic relations, there must be a better understanding and recognition of the respective political, but also the emotional particularities in the US and Europe. The US should accept an evolving and culturally diverse Europe and not exploit the sometimes difficult process of integration for its own reasons. The US does not really understand the integration process that Europe is now going through. Almost a very shallow perception of Europe too often, and a failure to empathize. At the same time, Europe is failing to empathize with the United States, particularly on the deep emotions, understandable emotions of post 9/11. And even things like the relative power now of the euro, the relative strength of the euro and the dollar. Even symbols like the new Airbus 380, the double-decker aircraft, the symbolic power that is suggesting for Europe. Secondly, on the next question of the impact of changing transatlantic relations on the rest of the world, I hope that wasn't painful. The transatlantic partners should adjust the institutional framework that have bound them together since World War II. They should engage in developing new forms of partnership that match the challenges of the 21st century. It's not a time to turn back and look back to the old ways of doing things. No point looking back nostalgically. There are new dynamics which require new ideas, new thoughts, new processes. It's about being nimble and more flexible. The purpose of NATO, this is what's come from other sessions, should be redefined, although I thought it was being redefined quite significantly at the moment, transforming itself from an institution of the Cold War to an institution with a new mission serving global peace. Security, democracy, diplomacy. Afghanistan, is that a new model? Dialogue about emerging global economic challenges should be intensified. The G2, the US European challenge, the dollar euro challenge, responsiveness particularly to vulnerabilities. Do we need any new institutions? I ask the question, let's hopefully get an answer or two in the next few minutes. Other global issues of concern should be identified and joint strategies to address them be developed, in particular a broader understanding and strategy to address the challenges of the Middle East, what President Bush referred to in his State of the Union address as the Greater Middle East. Also as well about regions working together, but can we? How much is the quartet a viable format now for moving forward? Finally, on the question of economics and business, and that part that could be played by economics and business, and certainly business in improving relations. Transatlantic partners should really be recognizing that the deep society and business relations across the Atlantic must now be strengthened, which in turn can help reinvigorate relations on the political level. Is that frankly too idealistic? But not just at the business level. How do companies build those bridges? What kind of inputs and ideas are needed? My reckoning is we have about an hour to address that now. And Javier Solana, would you like to kick off with your first 3 minutes of thoughts, please?
Thank you very much. I know that it's not the first time, as the moderator has said, that in the day of today we talk about this issue. But let me be brief to try to see what at the first intervention I would like to transmit to you. I mean, to the first question, what are the possible scenarios? I only see one scenario, the scenario in which the European Union and the United States continue to have a solid relationship, a constructive relationship, and a fair relationship that will be fundamental for the European Union, fundamental for the United States, and fundamental for the world. I'd like to start with that statement. But having said that, we have to recognize that the year 2003 has been a complicated year. And I don't think we have to go to the analysis of the reasons, because are in the minds of everybody. Let me give you 3 or 4 ideas, which in the 3 minutes that I have, I will try to develop later on, could be a manner in which we can solve some of the problems that have arrived in the year 2003. The first idea that I would like to mention, which is not on the economic field, is more on the partnership. We have to be aware that we are partners, allies, and we are not a tool in a box. I mean, nobody wants to be a tool in a box. Everybody wants to be an ally, everybody wants a partner. And therefore, what partners do is define the mission together. That expression that came not long ago about the mission determines the coalition, I think was very, unfortunately, at least unfortunately for the Europeans, as we understand our relationship with the United States. Therefore, I think that partnership should define the mission together, and this is a basic element of a real partnership. The second thing that I would like to transmit to you is that we have to get accustomed that the sharing of the burden is not only military. Sometimes they accuse the European Union of not having sufficient military capabilities. But the burden is not only military, and we have to underline that. And I think if we take the burden in all the domains in which we share things, I think that the burden should be shared in an equitable manner and in a better form, and avoiding the tension that we had lived in the year 2003. Now, the last thing is an obligation. It's a moral obligation that both the European Union and the United States do have to do together. And we cannot avoid to do it. We have to be committed to that. We cannot continue giving the impression that we give more importance to the symptoms to the roots or to the causes. We have to apply with the same tenacity the fight against the causes as we do about the symptoms. This is a very fundamental thing that the countries of the world which have a better GDP, a higher GDP, have the obligation to do it vis-à-vis the rest of the world. The last thing I would like to say, the pre-last thing I would like to say is that we have to have an honest debate about multilateralism. As you know very well, we have defined already in our security strategy as Europeans that we believe on multilateralism, but we put the adjective effective multilateralism. And we want to use the two terms together, multilateralism and efficiency. We don't want multilateralism, multilateral institutions which are not able to resolve the problems. So we want to do it in an efficient manner. And on that, we have to reach an agreement to see how we handle the institutions of the multilateral world. The last thing I would like to say is that we have to avoid theological debates. We have had so many, too many, and we have to get to work in a forward-looking agenda. The moderator has mentioned many topics, and we are in the mind of everybody, from Iraq to Afghanistan, for the peace process in the Middle East to many other things which are of economic nature. I would like to mention one that probably nobody would expect that I mention. But in a few days, a decision is going to be taken about where the installation that is going to do the research on fusion for the century is going to be placed. We Europeans, we expect the Americans to support the European proposal, and probably the United States is going to support Japan. It's something that is difficult to understand by us, but in any case, this type of forward-looking agenda in which we talk, we cooperate in practical things is absolutely fundamental. But going back to the first part of the question, I don't conceive a world in which the European Union and the United States are far apart.
Quick question, Javier. Any dangers ahead, though? You've talked about possible scenarios. What about the dangers if those scenarios are not embraced?
I'm sorry?
What about the dangers if those scenarios are not really embraced? In other words, of a degree of indecision, a degree of lack of action?
On the multilateral system, you mean? I think that what we have to be is a little bit more patient, maybe, and get the debates all the way to the end. Because as we have said, and we have said publicly in the first strategic document that we have produced, the European Union, not country by country, but collectively, we said very clearly that when the rules are broken, responses have to be taken. But the response doesn't have to be necessarily a response which is military. We have plenty of other, in the panoplia of possibilities. We have diplomacy, we have many other things that we can do that we have to use, and we have to use, if possible, together. I mean, we have plenty of examples from the Balkans to many other places in which we have cooperated, and without any doubt, the moment we cooperated properly, things have gone better. And on Iraq, we are seeing now, I mean, at the very last moment, when the ex-Secretary Baker goes through the countries that appear to be the most distant from the United States on Iraq, to ask for real help to Iraq to cancel the debt, the response has been positive. Therefore, the Europeans act reasonably when the questions are reasonable.
Right. Thank you very much. I will come to you quite soon in the audience to engage in this as well. Erkki Liikanen, on the enterprise and information areas, as a commissioner, your view, please.
I don't want to go through many scenarios. We can have black, grey and rosy. But I believe that economy, business can be basis for the rosy scenario. When we had difficult times, tensions between EU-US relations, we went back to the figures. Today, US-owned companies in Europe have more than 4 million jobs. European-owned companies in the United States have directly more than 4 million jobs. Indirectly, these two have created another 4 million. More than 12 million jobs are run by either US companies in Europe or European companies in the US. That's number one thing. Second thing, normally we always look at trade figures. But trade figures actually are not the most important indicator. Most important indicator on the depth of relations are foreign investments. And when you look at the foreign assets, out of all foreign assets of American companies, 60% are in Europe, 60%. Out of all foreign assets of European companies, majority is United States. So it tells its very, very deep commitment. And third issue, when you look at major companies in Europe or America, let's say Intel, they have their labs in Silicon Valley, they produce microprocessors in Ireland. Siemens, they are in Munich, but they are in America. They act as good corporate citizens on both sides. What is actually their nationality? They are transatlantic companies to whom we must give a proper marketplace to act. For that reason, I think that the message here to guarantee this rosy scenario is that on the political side, we must work for regulatory convergence, which can lead to barrier-free trade and investments in Europe and in America. But to have this kind of regulatory convergence doesn't come for free. We must first understand how each other's political system works. And there's a lot to improve in that area. I mean, in America, difficult for us to follow how different agencies in Washington take different decisions in spite of what the executive says that we agree. Sometimes difficult to follow Congress without the executive. We are not always better either. I mean, when Commission takes a decision, it will be voted down in some committee in member states. So we need more understanding how political system works to make this convergence possible. And second, this must always be based on sensitivity and respect. Because we, all political leaders, have got the mandate of the people. They must respect the public sentiment. And in that area, both ways, we need more understanding. But in this rosy scenario, we have a transatlantic marketplace, convergent regulatory framework, investments go both and people can go both ways, where the economies compete and complete each other. And from this force, EU and US economies could be powerful tools for democracy and growth. And if the exchange rate market would be less volatile, it would be even easier. Thank you.
Erkki, thank you very much indeed. Niall, would you like to give us your thoughts from the business perspective?
Yes, if I might, first of all, Nick, just a very personal view. I mean, I am a very passionate proponent of strong transatlantic relations. Not just because it's good for the EU and it's good for Europe and it's good for North America, but because when that relationship is working well, that is the most powerful force to underpin growing prosperity in the rest of the world, and indeed the spreading of that prosperity if we do it well. And therefore, I think on both sides of the Atlantic, we have a heavy responsibility to the rest of the world to make sure that our relationship is working very well. Last year, those of you who were here will remember there was a very visceral mood abroad. I left here last year deeply disturbed and depressed. It recalled to me the words of my mother, who said to me when I was a young man, that she said, "You may succeed in life once you learn how to disagree without being disagreeable." And last year we were all distinctly disagreeable with each other, and it seems to me a relationship that's so important, where there can be honest and clear and important differences. We must be able to conduct the discussion of those differences at a more mature level. Now this year the mood is quite different. There's much more optimism abroad, and optimism of course always makes people more free-thinking, more capable of embracing change, wanting to do things better. And I really think we have to build on that quickly, because moods can change. And one of the things I would like to say to our American friends here is I'm hugely admiring of the fact you are here. Because I have a feeling if I was American last year, I might have said, well, a plague on your house, I'm not going back there. Why should I go there to be abused? But they have come back, and they've come back in even bigger numbers and clearly committed to the building of this relationship. Now, if you put it on an economic front, Doug Daft and I have agreed recently to take on the co-chairmanship of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which is a dialogue which was, in its inception, was about making sure that business together across the Atlantic worked well together, but in particular was able to alert the political establishment to what they were doing or not doing or contemplating, which was getting in the way of a barrier-free transatlantic market. And that's what we're now going to try to revive. We might come back to some more detail of that in a moment. We will try to keep it very focused. But there are two things, it seems to me, are more than anything else in the economic sphere are important, and where we, again, Europe and the United States has a heavy responsibility. One is on trade. We just have to get the Doha trade round back in action. And we have to do that, Europe and the United States, by taking a leadership role and putting proposals on the table, not trying to leave negotiations till a second to midnight and the hope we might get something better out of it. We have a heavy responsibility. We committed to it in Doha, and both of us should be conscious of that responsibility. It's even more important, it seems to me, just now, because there are protectionist tendencies re-emerging on both sides of the Atlantic. They're very real and they're very dangerous. And protectionism is in the end voodoo economics. It's, I'm all right as long as my rags are slightly less tatty than your rags. And we know what that brings. We've been there once before. We tried it. It was the 1930s. It doesn't work. And we have a heavy responsibility across the Atlantic to lead in terms of ensuring that these tendencies are put back where they belong, which is buried deep below ground. Now, there are other things which we can come back to later in terms of what we can do on the business front. One passing thought I have on institutions, because I've heard from some of the other discussions there were that there should be new institutions to bind across the Atlantic. I'm not so sure we need new institutions. I think what we need to do is focus on that small number of institutions and make them work well, rather than try to invent a lot of new ones. Having said that, I do also think that there's a heavy responsibility, both in the US and in the European Union, to actually put resource and thinking and effort behind supporting, remodeling, strengthening the international institutions, which are important to us, but are also important to the rest of the world. And whether that's the WTO or whether it's the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Court, the UN itself, those are the institutions which the world needs to function well. And they won't function well unless there is an alignment of interest and effort between Europe and the United States, and a recognition, and a public recognition, that shared sovereignty on a global basis is indeed enhanced sovereignty.
Now, thank you. We're already beginning to merge all three questions very efficiently. Congressman Rob Portman from Ohio, what's your view from across the Atlantic? You are close to the administration, of course.
Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be part of the panel and inviting me back. I can't tell you how many people I've run into in the halls of Davos this year who said, I can't believe you came back. Because, as Niall said, it was a rough year last year. But all the more reason to come back. And although it was difficult at times, I'm not sure I would agree that it was always disagreements. I think we had a constructive dialogue, and I think it was very important for me as a supporter of the administration and as a member of the U.S. Congress to hear, and also for the people here who were not as familiar with our system to understand at least what our true motives were. And they may have disagreed. It's a very important dialogue, so I'm glad to be back, and I think the transatlantic dialogue is the key. I agree with Secretary General Solana. There's only one scenario, and it's along the lines of what Niall said. It's the key scenario, which is cooperation and enhancing the dialogue and the relationship, not so much because of the relationship itself, which is important, but because of what it means to the rest of the world. And I'll talk a little about that, but I don't think the challenges we confront that are global can be properly addressed unless we work together with the North Americans and the Europeans on a transatlantic basis. That's why it's so important to me. It's been a difficult year. Javier, you said 2003 was a complicated year. You're a great diplomat. And diplomacy was where we had the most trouble in the last year. On the other hand, I think it's where the most promise is now. And I say that because I really think the diplomatic front, because of the problems of last year, we can make some real progress this year. Vice President Cheney laid out a bit of a challenge today, and President Bush did in the White House speech, and I think there's a receptive attitude toward it, which is working together toward expanding democracy, free markets, freedom, and getting at the underlying causes of terrorism. Yes, we have to keep working together on security, and that's very important, and NATO needs to continue to transform itself, and what NATO's doing in Afghanistan, I think, is a terrific example of that. But these deeper-rooted causes are ones that we need urgently to begin addressing so that a decade from now, we don't have to resort to the security alternative. And that, I think, is what I hope what people got from this speech today in part was that was the first priority. And I think that could begin, and I think we should challenge each other. I think we should involve the G8 this year much more aggressively. There's a G8 meeting in the United States. That'd be a good place to do it. I think we should quantify the burden that you talked about in terms of the burden sharing, because we do think we share more of the burden on security, but there are other ways to measure other parts of that burden if you're going to focus on literally changing societies, having them embrace this notion of self-government, freedom of the individual, capital markets, and so on. Maybe that burden can be quantified better and shared. I do think that on the commercial front, while we had more success up to now, we may have more challenges. And I say that in part because of what Niall said about the creeping protectionism. I see that in my own country. I see it among my own constituency. It's a battle. I think the corporate community should be issued a challenge today, which Doug heard me talk about at lunch, and Niall, which is explaining the benefits to their own employees, at least, so people understand what the benefits are of a more liberal trading system. We certainly in the States don't hear much from workers, except those who are affected negatively, and we hear a lot from them. And the corporate community has been, at least in the United States, reluctant to engage itself in this debate and talk about and educate people as to the somewhat more complicated, but I think evident benefits of a freer trading system. One reason we have some more friction points, and I won't go over them, you all know what they are, but we have many friction points with the Europeans right now on agriculture, steel, beef hormones, GMO, is because of that closer integration. And I think the comments of Commissioner Liikanen were right on. The reason we have more points of friction is we have incredible integration. U.S. exports to Europe this year will be over $250 billion, back to the United States over $325 billion. You mentioned 12 million jobs being created. We have $700 billion of U.S. investment in Europe. You all have, Europeans have over $850 billion of investment in our country. I mean, it's amazing the deeper integration that we truly have. That's going to cause some friction, and I don't think that's necessarily something we shouldn't expect or something that we can't work through. We're doing it right now on the FitzGerald issue. This is a tough issue for it. This is the Foreign Sales Corporation issue where it was taken to WTO by the EU. We're now working through it. We're going to work through it. The steel decision, we're working through that. We've made changes. Granted, a little bit late from your point of view, but these things can be worked through. So my bigger concern is not so much the EU-US specific issues, but the larger issues of trade. Doha having fallen apart is a real problem. On the other hand, think about it. It was the EU and the United States that started Doha. Without us, it wouldn't have started. Without us, it won't start again. The exchange of letters between Commissioner Lamy and Ambassador Zellick over the last couple of weeks were very promising to me because basically it said we're going to put important issues on the table to the developing world, agriculture most specifically, and move ahead. So I'm hopeful there, but I think we have more challenges because I do think our citizens are having a tough time understanding globalization, what the benefit is to them. The final thing I'll mention is in terms of some specifics, I think this G2 idea is an excellent idea for the purposes of trade, also for diplomacy. But if we don't have our act together, you can't expect the rest of the world, I think, as a practical matter to come together. The Hong Kong meeting this year that's being talked about would be a good place for us to start on the G2 process. China accession to the WTO and having China work within this new law-based, rules-based system, I think is something we should work on together. And only together can we make progress there. On issues like intellectual property, their VAT tax, agriculture, and others. So I come at it that I think we have a great opportunity on the diplomatic front, more challenges on the economic front, but certainly a more forward-looking, results-oriented relationship. I love when Secretary General Solana talked about efficiency. We Americans tend to be a little more impatient, and I think efficiency in the multilateral organizations is incredibly important to having them work constructively and to keep the U.S. involvement.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. Doug Daft, Chairman and Chief Executive of Coca-Cola. Can you try and begin to bring some of the arguments together?
Well, they say last wicket or clean-up hitter, depending on what side of the Atlantic. I think no matter, from what you hear, no matter what scenario you look at, for the foreseeable future, the US and Europe will continue to demonstrate a closeness in the relationship than any other partners that they have anywhere else. So I think that's a given. I was hoping to show my in-depth knowledge by quoting the statistics, but they've already been done. Actually, I have 13 million in my brief sheet jobs on both sides. But the economic, we rounded upwards. The economic interdependence is given. The shared foreign policy concerns are given, but they don't always guarantee common political action. And right now I see four key forces that perhaps are pulling us in opposite direction, leaving the economic independence aside and the common foreign policy issues, but four forces that might pull us in opposite direction. First one in foreign policy, the geography and history of both sides of the Atlantic mean that we approach the priorities with simply different policies, different perspectives. History dictates that. It's come up a lot in the last couple of days. It was a point of conjecture last year. It's almost a point of acceptance this year that the United States' greater military capabilities simply offers more political options. Obviously what's happening in Europe, which, as we heard over lunch today, in Monsieur Trichet's points, it's fascinating to see how Europe is evolving, the EU integration. But it's the reverse of how the US looks at itself. In other words, the sovereign rights are being, in Europe, moved up into multilateral, multinational, or supranational levels, where the US, it's just ingrained in terms of sovereign rights of the states. But the greatest concern I have is this issue of the common values that have been on both sides of the Atlantic. Common values that if you're in the brand business, no matter whether it's computers or beverages or food items, the common values you have to appeal to that were there 10 years, 30 years, 60 years ago, are now, we now see perceived differences in these core values. And that could then, I say, takes an opposite direction. So given this strange dichotomy of shared interests, but sometimes opposing perspective, I could see two scenarios, given that there will always be a relationship, and a deep one, but there could be two scenarios. One, we just bumble along, loosely coordinating foreign policy to common challenges, in trade more and more opting for bilateral agreements rather than multilateral. Or the second one, which is where policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic take the opportunity to build a barrier-free, and Erkki mentioned this, a barrier-free transatlantic market over the next 10 or 15 years with a whole new level of regulatory and economic convergence. Now, I was born an optimist, I remain an optimist, and I believe the second scenario is the one that will ensure, and I think that's why Niall and I agreed to take on this task with this renewed, if you like, transatlantic business dialogue, because we believe we should make a difference, but more importantly, we can make a difference to this. Thank you.
Doug, thank you very much indeed. Does anyone down there want to interject? Okay, plenty of, could you move the microphones? But I just want to clear one point on this G2. Rob, you talked about the need, can you take the microphones across so we don't waste any time? Do we have unity here about whether the G2 idea should run and should take off much more strongly? Javier.
I would not be in favor of what you call a G2. If I understand properly, it's an organization formalized that meets every month and a half or every 2 months with a secretariat and bureaucracy and all that. I don't think this is the appropriate thing. Between the United States and the European Union, we have to have a normalized relationship that doesn't need any other structure than what we have. I mean, let me my own experience. It's rare, the week, that I don't have several telephone calls with Secretary Powell or Condoleezza Rice. I don't need a G2. I have a G2 already. It's very rare the day that people who work with me do not travel to Washington or to New York. Sometimes I have difficulty to find my collaborators here in Brussels, where they should be working because they are in Washington or they are in New York. I mean, really, the level of integration in everyday life is much more profound than what we think. It does not reflect on the higher level, sometimes on the decision we take. Now, so I will be not in favor of creating new organizations. Now, what I will be in favor, and very, very normally with enormous enthusiasm in favor, is to create or to recreate something that was created in the 60s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. I think it's a new generation of Americans, a new generation of Europeans, a new generation of Americans that do not understand, because they are too young to understand what was the consequence of the war, what is Europe, why Europe is united, why we decided not to have war again in Europe and we created the European Union, what does it mean, the European Union? And on the other hand, there are Europeans that we don't know, or they don't know, what is going on in the United States at this very moment, and what is the sentiment that they have after events which are very important. One is 11/9, but the other is 9/11. They are true, 11/9 and 9/11. One is the falling of the Berlin Wall, and the other is what we know what it is. Now, I would very much encourage those who can, and probably here are two very important entrepreneurs from the United States and from the European Union, that could take initiative of that nature to recreate a dialogue that existed. I think the Trilateral was created for that, Bilderberg was created for that. I think that those two institutions are meet people that are not the real actors of today. And in any case, they will not be the real actors of tomorrow. And the 21st century is a very important century, and we have to construct again a connection of generations, the new generations of Americans and the Europeans. That's what I will try to do. And I'm very happy to see Robert, was representative from Ohio, because it's very important what he has said. I mean, he is coming back. He's a young representative. He wants to know what Europe is about, what we are doing here. He has a passport. He travels. And that is a very important thing. You don't find many like him. So I would like to find as many as possible like him. And also, from our side, the same response. But I think we have a problem that is generational, that is going to be very important to tackle. And we have the responsibility, those who are a little bit older like me, to have the responsibility to let something organize so that the new generation don't...
Can we just be clear on this G2 issue? I mean, do we have a division here? Erkki, do you need a G2? Can we have short answers here, please?
No, well, we don't need. We are working every day directly without any extra bureaucracy.
I think you have it. I think you have twice a year a EU-US summit, which has been a ritual dance up to now. If that was actually used in a business-like way, focused on a number of issues, then that's all you need.
All right, fine. By the way, Rob, do you feel in a minority with a passport?
Actually, I think most of my colleagues now have passports because one of my colleagues, the leader, said he didn't have one, so everybody quickly got their passports. Let me just, on the G2 idea, my point was with regard to trade, commercial activity, and I think it's, practically speaking, only possible to make progress right now if we come together. And agriculture, obviously, is the big issue on the table for the rest of the world. And I couldn't agree more with Secretary General Solana about not creating a big new bureaucracy with staff and so on. That's not what we need, and you have the direct contact. But I do think that there's an interest to formalize a little bit more our commercial relationship so that we're coming at this without the perception, at least, in so much of the world that we have such very different, sometimes tactics as well as objectives.
Okay,
that
fine.
was my point.
I can see at least two. Charles Grant, and then, I'm sorry, I can't see who you are, but Charles first.
Make a couple of...
Could you just introduce yourself?
Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform in London. I have two suggestions as a way of improving transatlantic relations, one economic, one in the security sphere. On the economic sphere, I think Europeans should be much less complacent about their slow economic growth compared to the US. If you extrapolate from existing tendencies, according to some projections, the American economy will be twice as big as the EU economy in 2050. That has huge strategic implications in terms of Europe's ability to invest in military equipment, in terms of its ability to use soft power, aid, and in terms of the psychology of the transatlantic relationship. There'll be a sense of American triumphalism. So in the short run, clearly, Erkki, Liikanen and others have to work very, very hard on the Lisbon agenda to push that through, and others have to work on reforming the Stability and Growth Pact instead of just leaving it on one side. In the long run, we have to tackle things like natalism. How do we make Europeans have more babies to overcome the demographic problems, which are part of the economic malaise, and how do we get universities that are as good as America's universities? My security point, very briefly, is that I think America has to be more positive about Europe's development in common foreign and security policy. There are divided voices in Washington, but I think they should note that Europe is beginning to move forward. The deal on Iran, hatched by the big three foreign ministers recently, the recent agreements on military planning, and the fact that the EU will take over in Bosnia very soon from NATO. These are positive developments. I think that America should welcome Europe's growth in this area. Of course, there is a downside for America, because if Europe becomes a real power in foreign policy, then that will constrain America's freedom of action. It'll force America to be more multilateralist, as it already is in the trade sphere. But I would still say it's good for America because actually we agree on fundamental values and many of our fundamental interests are similar. So I'd say to America, don't try and divide and rule like you did in the first half of last year. It only makes people more anti-American in Europe, and it won't work anyway. So welcome the CFSP.
Just to clarify, Charles, are you saying that you thought the Vice President, when he was speaking here this morning, was a bit too grudging about the changes that are taking place in the security field in Europe?
I don't think he was particularly grudging. He didn't actually criticise them. Clearly, many of his colleagues in the US administration have been very critical of Britain's decision to back France and Germany in establishing an EU planning cell. He didn't criticise them, which is good. President Bush has not criticised this deal. I think Tony Blair has persuaded President Bush. It's better to have this deal on European defence, because if there is such a deal on a European headquarters, then the British are in there steering it to make sure it doesn't damage NATO. And I think Cheney's presumably got that message, even if not everybody in the Pentagon has.
All right, a quick spin here about those particular 2 points, the diverging economies, or certainly the way America will, within a few years, be such an enormous economic power. Niall?
Well, as Charles said, it is the demographics, and the demographics are driving them apart. We're in population decline in Europe, and some of the bigger countries in particular. And it's not only that we're in declining numbers, but of course we're aging. And some of the numbers, for instance, for Germany are very scary indeed. Currently about 25% of the population over the age of 60. In 20 years it'll be 40% of the population. And Germany will need at least 1 million net immigrants of working age to support its economy. Which brings me to the second point, that where the US has a huge advantage over Europe is it has a tradition and a whole ethos which absorbs immigrants and absorbs people willingly and positively from the outside world and helps them to prosper. We have a grudging approach to it in Europe. We don't really have a policy in any way that is recognizable across Europe. Yet there has never been a moment when we needed to be more open to importing skills to sustain the economy and to increase its competitiveness and its productivity.
Is there an acceptance here that these demographic and economic realities, though, are going to be problematic when it comes to trying to build and strengthen transatlantic relations?
Well, first of all, this doesn't answer, but it's irreversible fact that, and I've forgotten the exact statistics, but in 2050, the US is the only so-called developed economy where the population will continue to grow through the years 2050, particularly in the underage group, and where diversity will continue to increase. There's no other developed economy in the world where that is going to happen. So I just believe it's an irreversible and inevitable fact. And I think it was The Economist magazine whose lead story said, if you think you've seen the great days of the United States now, and they're talking about decline and falls, you haven't seen anything yet. So I think there's inevitability in it.
Erkki.
On this cooperation about complacency, we should go a little bit more into detail. First of all, extrapolations are always dangerous. If you want to get proof of that, start to look how China looks in 50 years. It's better to be a little more short-term. My second point is I agree with this complacency. That the real story in American stories since 1995 has been strong productivity growth. And today, when we have analyzed it sector by sector, it's very interesting. It's in two areas: ICT manufacturing industries and wholesale and retail trade. Those two areas have made the difference. When you go through all manufacturing sectors, it goes both ways. And learning what we must have from here is, number one, we need to continue to invest in ICT. That is taking place. But we must be much more aggressive in reorganizing the businesses and companies and administrations. If you don't reorganize the way you process your work, you can't reap the productivity gain. And there we have a lot to learn from the United States. But there are also strong European success stories. Let's be clear. Telecommunication services, 15-20% faster productivity growth in 10 years. Some industrial sectors also, food sector, clearly strong, and so forth. It's not only one run, we must be a little more precise. But I'm a great admirer of American entrepreneurship, which is actually related to immigration, and also its own solution to the population problem. And there Europe can learn. We must see immigration as a huge opportunity, not only as a challenge. In that area, I hope enlargement, when we get new neighbors, it opens our minds. We need first and second generation immigrants which create companies which also help us to solve our problems in the age structure. Thank you.
Just to be clear, politically, do you think that this is something which is now being addressed by the politicians, certainly here in Europe, given what President Bush announced, 2 or 3 weeks ago, about guest workers, the change in status of guest workers in the States? Are we moving fast here if we're suffering from this great shortage of labour?
Our legislation, of course, in asylum and refugee policy is different, because it's a question about the rights. If somebody has rights, you get asylum. It's been never, so economically considered issue like United States. But I'm sure it is changing. We are coming with a program to the European Commission in 2 weeks' time, where we say that we should look the issue of immigration policy as a part of entrepreneurship exercise, which totally might change the mindset. Instead of looking at what kind of challenges that creates to your social services, we look what kind of opportunities that creates to release the entrepreneurial potential in Europe.
If I could just add something to what Erkki said, or at least to take it on another stage, there's another issue which Europe is at a current disadvantage. Because at the end of the day, what will drive enterprise and what will drive productivity increasement is innovation. And we currently have a climate for science in Europe which is not conducive to keeping good scientists. Somewhere between 30 and 40% of those who graduated with first-class science degrees in Europe in the last 10 years are currently working in the United States. There's a drain of our good scientists. Many scientific establishments are gradually, not publicly, but gradually beginning to move their scientific base outside Europe to the United States and indeed to Asia as well, because there is not a climate which is either conducive to or attractive to scientists. And let me just take one example, just to be very specific. We have an issue which both Erkki and Javier will know very well in the European Patents Office. We've been 14 years trying to get a unified European Patents Office. And with great drama, it's now been announced that we will have it. You'll have to have only 3 languages, as long as you translate everything into 19 others within 12 months. The cost of a patent in Europe is 6 times what it is in the United States, and the time it takes to get the patent registered is twice as long. So we have to be very clear on the specifics. When we can't make the rhetorical statements about we are going to be very competitive, we are going to be very innovative, we are going to be the most enterprising economy in the world, unless we back it up with the very specific issues which have to be addressed. Then we will have an opportunity to play on a more equal basis with the United States.
Well, just quickly on that point, those scientists in the United States who are doing such good work are often European. And so, as a legislator, I can say this, I suppose, but it's partly public policy, and it's partly coming up with better public policy to encourage innovation. And we don't do a great job of it always. We're losing science, as you know. We're outsourcing to India, to China, to other countries, but we may do a better job. But to this gentleman's question, just one quick comment. There is so much to learn between one another across the Atlantic. And I spent a lot of time here this week talking about pensions and talking about both the public and private pensions and the aging societies. We have a huge problem too. Ours is not as pronounced as yours, but nonetheless, our current systems cannot sustain themselves because they're pay-as-you-go systems with an aging population, lower fertility, higher life expectancies. We have a very interesting mix of public and private. It's different than almost every country in Europe, as is every country in Europe is almost different. We had very interesting discussions, comparative discussions, and best practices is something that should be part of this relationship. And it's an excellent example where we're going to face basically the same challenges. Immigration is another one. The President's proposal, although innovative, and I think probably faces reality, is going to have a very hard time getting through the legislative process in the United States to become reality. So we basically are in a situation where we might be looking to Europe for some of the more legal means to have what is currently a largely illegal labor force in the United States, 8 to 10 million people, to figure out how to work through the benefits of immigration, which are obvious to me, but do it through a legal means. So there's room for us to learn from one another.
I've just let that argument run because it seemed to me we're talking about trying to build bridges when actually there are a lot of diverging realities which could cause great difficulties, and that's what we've been exploring. Right, let me get a couple more views, please, and then over here.
My name's Dan Smith. I run a peace-building NGO based in London called International Alert. And what we need in terms of this debate is that where we are working, whether it's Sierra Leone or Liberia or the Caucasus or Sri Lanka, we actually need cooperation, partnership with a lot of big partners, including very often US and European government agencies, sometimes the EU local representative and so on. And it's occurring to me, listening to this discussion, that in the first half of last year, when the debate and the disputes were at their hottest, it was never difficult, actually, to find gatherings where people said the partnership is essential, it's going to go on. It was not difficult in the field to be finding American diplomats and European diplomats who were saying the partnership's essential, it's going to go on, don't worry. The problem was not, if you like, at the working level. I mean, I regard myself as being extremely democratic, and the only problem with democracy is that we keep on electing the politicians. It's at the level of political leadership that this keeps on coming up. Now, if I sort of pass out something out of the analysis we were hearing earlier, It is that despite the ructions of last year, the partnership is going to continue. Right? So the ructions, the political ructions, the disputes, the high-profile disputes between the political leaders are not going to put at risk that long-term partnership. What they could put at risk is the fruits of short-term practical cooperation. And that seems to me partly where the debate should focus, onto the political leadership and their effect on what is happening on the ground at the time that they're having their arguments.
Javier and Rob, if you can address that in a moment. Let me just pick up this point over here. And anyone else want to contribute? A couple at the back, please, way back.
I'm Espen Barth Eide, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I have a question, I think, primarily to Javier Solana, but to anybody else as well. I do indeed think that transatlantic relations are improving, and strongly compared to last year's Davos, as many people have said. And I think that part of the reason is that there is some more realism on the American side about its strengths and weaknesses and the need for allies, but also some more self-confidence on the European side, and the existence now of the European strategy document means that Europe has finally taken up some of the questions, the very serious questions being posed by the US side, and attempting to give some European answers to them. What that suggests is a transatlantic partnership between two pillars, EU and the US. And my question then is, where does that leave NATO? Because NATO, as we know it today, is an institution in which there is one superpower and several individual allies, most of them in Europe, one in North America, Canada. Isn't it necessary that NATO, in order to survive, have to adapt to a reality where there's a strong EU on the inside, a US-friendly EU, but a strong political expression of European identity? Thank you.
Does anyone else want to contribute just on this issue of security only? No. Do you want to? Is that a yes or no? No. Okay. Javier, would you like to, do you want to pick up on security? I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Jim.
Yeah, Jim Thompson from RAND. Well, I was going to pick up on several, but I'll just focus on security. You know, we're all feeling very good now because of the year of the Transatlantic, improved cooperation and the like. But the truth is that the dispute was about one issue, and that is really the issue of wars of choice fought by the United States, or threatened to be fought by the United States, outside of the European neighborhood. And that issue is now off the table from the standpoint there's no such possible war or threatened war at the moment. But the future can hold many things, and whether there's a preemption doctrine or not, so long as there is the threat of terrorism, that issue is in front of us. So I take the point about optimism, but it's an important thing to start to work on that problem now, or else we'll have the same problem of Davos again down the road.
I do want to take those 2 points over there, but what about, Javier, could you address those particular issues of partnership?
I'll try to address the three very briefly. The one, I completely agree with the cooperation on the ground. And the ground is not only work in Liberia, ground may be Brussels, or ground may be other places. It's probably true that at the very high, and in particular in the Security Council of the UN, has been profound disagreements that have been publicly expressed. But levels below that, the cooperation has followed. Of course, there cannot be a cooperation as constructive in the year 2003 because we had a problem at the top. But I agree with you that in all the experience I have lived on the ground, being in Liberia, or being in Africa, or being in the Balkans, or being anywhere, the cooperation has continued to be very constructive and very good. Now, on the Norwegian front, two things I would like to say. It is true that during the year 2001, 2002, and even the beginning of 2003, the leaders of the United States thought that the European Union did not care about the real problems of the world of today, that they were not serious against the fight against terrorism, that it was a complete misunderstanding because we have been fighting against terrorism for many, many years in some countries of the European Union for more than 20 years. But in particular on proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, it seems to some of the leaders of the United States that we didn't care enough, or we did not understand really the damage and the problem of proliferation. I think that with the document that we have produced, approved by all the leaders of the European Union, we show very clearly that the strategic concern, the strategic issues of the United States and the European Union are the same. And not only are the leaders, because you see, for instance, the German Marshall Foundation, the polls that have been produced, it's very difficult to distinguish a European from an American on these issues that we are talking here, as far as proliferation, as far as terrorism, as far as the strategic things. We may have disagreements on other things. Now, on NATO, I think that I have spent in my previous incarnations, and even in this incarnation, debating about NATO out of area so many years that I was really tired of that discussion. What has happened? That when the things are needed, when the situation is mature, as happened to Newton, the apple fell down. And the NATO is now in Afghanistan. Can you imagine any other thing more out of area than Afghanistan? We are there. And there with the German people, with German soldiers running NATO in Afghanistan with PRTs together with Enduring Freedom. I mean, 2 years ago, this was absolutely inconceivable, because it was not necessary. Now it has been necessary, and there we are. So let's not spend talking about potential things in the future thinking that we are going to diverge, because when the reality comes, we don't diverge, we are there. Now, Jim, I think it's true what you have said. You know very well, because you have followed as a very important actor all this period of time. But you have to recognize that if we were now citizens from another planet, and we were here, and we look at Iraq, probably we will say it doesn't have any sense, anything. If we were citizens from another planet, coming and looking at what the situation. Now we have now. The weapons of mass destruction do not appear. Bremen going in New York, knocking at the door of Kofi Annan, please take over. I mean, it's very difficult. If you are honest, we are honest, and we were from another planet, the whole film has been rather strange. Of course, we are from this planet, and we know what is going on, and know what these things happen. But we are sophisticated people who have been engaged. But we cannot ask an ordinary people to understand completely what we understand, because we have been from the very beginning engaged on this issue. And we have to be careful, because the sentiment of the people who have not been involved, that is very important. I mean, when you see the new poll of the German Marshall Foundation on the question of values, as has been said before, we begin to have disagreements, and this is very serious. If we begin to have disagreements on core values, this is very serious.
Thank you very much. Both Doug and Niall would just like to say something. I haven't forgotten you. We've got about 7 minutes to run. Could you be brief?
I will, but now I've got it. I'm not going to give it up, if you don't mind.
You can come back afterwards, but I'd like to just draw the security bit to an end and just take these other couple of points.
But related to the last couple of points, I also agree that the relationship is there and it's given, but how deep and how we benefit from it in the short term is not given. And I think those 4 key points that I said are pulling us in opposite directions. I need a lot of work to overcome the geography and history of the two sides of the Atlantic, the core value perception. One example that springs to mind is the attitude now in the US towards religion, and the attitudes towards religion in Europe. They're entirely different. In fact, they've swung 360 degrees in both ways. So I think we have to work very hard at every level, business, policy level, political level, NGO level, to ensure we maximize the relationship and maximize the benefits for the maximum number of people. The other point, very quickly, which is I think new but somewhat related, we talked a little bit about before we came on. There is a whole group of people who are soon to be the leaders of both sides of the Atlantic, who have a total experience of Europe and total experience of the United States is all post-1980. I walk into a room now of our management in Europe and I treble the average age. We've got to be understanding of the opinions that these people have to put forward in order to guide the policies and the core values and the perceptions, relationships that we'd have to build to maximize even a trade relationship or anything else. Thank you.
I'd like to take very briefly, Nick, to take a slightly wider perspective on the security issue. You see, much of the security discussions I hear are all about tackling the symptoms of the security problem we have. And if we connect this back to what we were talking about earlier on the economic agenda in the end must be framed in order to be supportive of economic relations and to be supportive of political and security relations. And we need to get our minds around the causes of our security problems, the causes of instability. And what they are is about inequity. It's about inequity across the world. And when we tackle both the trade agenda within the economic agenda, we must be very clear that if we want to attend to the causes of our current insecurity and defend the prosperity which has been hard earned, then we have to be part of the attack on the poverty in the two-thirds of the rest of the world. Poverty of hope, poverty of resource, and poverty of opportunity. And if we don't, in 20 or 30 years' time, we'll be still having debates about how we have unsatisfactorily and inconclusively tackled the symptoms of the problems which are deeply ingrained around the world, which we have the economic power, if we do it together, to attend to.
There's a tremendous answer to point two. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and say I'm going to take these two remarks from in the middle of the auditorium, but I'm not going to be able to give you the chance to respond up here. Please.
Digby Jones, the Director General of the Confederation of British Industry, and it neatly segues from what Niall said, actually, and that was that to those people in the world who would love to have the problems of the European Union or the United States of America, and to the 8 former Soviet countries that are coming into the European Union in May, I am very worried that both the European Union and the United States at senior policy level actually are seriously losing their street cred, because no one believes them anymore. And if you watch the Commission, they can talk about the Lisbon Agenda, and yet they're marching valiantly towards 1970. If you actually watch America, they can say in Monterey they care about the poor, and then they put 84 billion more into a farm budget. If you look, there's no Kyoto engagement in America, and at the Commission, we also get doing what France wants on agriculture. And until those people who are disadvantaged actually believe that the people who make the rules in Europe and in the United States mean what they say when they say they care, we will, Niall is totally right, we will in 30 years' time be sitting here and talking about security issues again.
And now Nick could not give a chance to comment.
And one final point, please.
I'd love to respond to that too, Nick.
Hello, I'm Jacqueline Barber from the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. My comment is very much related to the previous one, and I want to return to the questions related to migration. It seems to me that if we talk about migration simply in terms of importing skills that we need, qualified manpower for Europe and the US, and we talk about excluding unskilled labour, or we talk about treating unskilled labour in terms of guest worker relations that in Europe have been proved not to work because no migrants are really guests. We're not learning the lessons, and we're simply perpetuating this big divide, taking what is useful for Western economies at the cost, impoverishing in two ways the third world economies. So I think this shows the same sort of myopic attitude.
I'm terribly sorry. I'm being told that we have to wrap up. We've overrun because of what happened before with the overrun of the dramatic overrun of the previous session. I do apologize, but these are my instructions. And like a good presenter, I always wind up when I'm told to. So I think we're going to wait for, he is here, Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach of Ireland, currently the President of the European Council, who will make an address to you, give some remarks, and also take 2 questions at the end, again constrained for time reasons. So do attract the microphone while the Taoiseach is speaking.